Good morning to everyone, wherever you are joining us from, whether it's the cold and snowy UK or like one of our panelists, lovely sunny Italy. So this is the second of our series of webinars, sort of with our friends at Lucidity. So following on from the Plan for Growth one last week. So just on the slides in front of you at the moment is just details of the other two that are coming up. So we've got one later this week regarding pricing strategy, because I don't think I've come across anyone that's ever got their pricing perfect. So that's I think a good webinar for all. And then those that are joining us with sort of a finance director or finance lead within your team, the webinar on the 24th I think is a really interesting look at how the finance professionals amongst us can get involved in strategy. So yeah, I'm Malcolm Pope. I'm one of the partners here at Shorts, and I'll now pass over to Tom.
Great, thanks, Malcolm. Morning, everyone. I'm Tom Rick McCarthy. For those not on the growth call last week, my track record is in technology and growing and turning things around. And the examples below were all about putting in place a simple strategy and then making it happen. So I'll be coming at today's call very much from a sort of a practitioner in a business sort of point of view. I'm really pleased to have on the call Dr. Monica Masuki. Monica, if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Tom. Welcome everybody also from my side. I'm Monica Masucci. I'm a lecturer in Strategy Entrepreneurship at the University of Sussex Business School. I'm also the director of the MSc in Strategic Innovation Management there. I have a PhD in Business Administration and I worked as a consultant for a strategic consulting firm for a few years. So I hope you will enjoy the webinar and welcome again from my side.
Great, thank you. So what we'll be doing today, folks, is first of all, I'll be doing a piece on how to avoid diversification. I'll explain that in a minute. But then Monica will be talking more about diversification more broadly. Then back to me, where I'll be going through a few practical examples and observations of other businesses that have diversified. And I think some interesting learning points there. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with Malcolm and Monica with some Q&A and also look at the poll results. Last week in growth, we covered quite a lot of ground. We covered quite a lot of tools, and actually today is just focused on one sort of main tool called the Ansoff Matrix, which is a framework to look at sort of diversification. So existing products and existing markets, where you are all sat now, is really about market penetration. You could, of course, look to do some product development, sell some new products or services to existing customers, or you could get into some market development. That's expanding your current activities into new sectors or new geographies. And lastly, what we'll look at is full diversification, new products to new markets, and the highest risk. And we'll sort of, so we're gonna move around this matrix today, looking at all of these different options. So first of all, just to put things into context, there are sort of different scenarios where diversification, comes into focus or not. So difficult trading, things under pressure, loss making, etc. Stable, so things are okay, profit, pipeline, customers, and then healthy, where things are sort of really growing. Now, probably, generally speaking, and there are a number of generalizations in this call, but generalization, I think most people at the moment are finding sort of things somewhat difficult, and short-term objectives are survival and then getting back to some sort of viable growth. But what's interesting is, and one of the examples we look at in a minute is a very distressed situation where someone had to diversify. But diversification is something that sort of healthy businesses look at all the time, because if you think about it, if you weren't considering new products or weren't considering new markets, you'd effectively be sitting still. So it's good practice to be thinking about diversification, I think, all of the time, and certainly it's something that healthy businesses do. They're looking at longer term diversification to continue their growth. Putting these slides together, I sort of came across this quote: one of the most challenging decisions a company can confront is whether to diversify. The rewards and risks are extraordinary. And I think that's sort of very true. What we're actually I'm going to now spend some time doing is just looking at existing products and existing markets, because quite often we talk to businesses and they say, well, we really need to diversify. And when we say to them, well, have you done X, Y, and Z? The answer is often no. And so what I want to do now is just go through some points, some ideas to check that you're wringing what you can out of your existing products and existing markets. And that's important because either you might not need to diversify, or if you do, then you can create good revenues and good cash flow and working capital to fund diversification, whether that be product development or market development. So if I cast back actually to March last year, and this was when we first went into lockdown, and I imagine, you know, at the time it sort of felt, well, no one was quite sure what was going to happen. And I went on to certain webinars to try to figure things out. And this was one of the crazier Zoom backgrounds at the time. You know, what you can see here is a whole bunch of sectors, largely in red, as you can see, because everyone was so unsure of what was going on. But just above the guy's head, green. So there was something that was growing, and that was actually food. And in the UK, food in that sort of month or two increased in terms of value and expenditure by a couple of £billion. So the point here is, whilst there's a lot of change going on around us, and a lot of things and sectors feel sort of under distress, that there's always growth going on. So it's really important to try to figure out, is the pressure in for your business, you know, for you, your sector, your customers, or your supply chain, is that a sort of a short or long-term impact? And that's something that you certainly need to sort of consider. We ran a similar webinar last May to about 180 businesses, and we polled that webinar, and these results came out, and it'll be interesting to compare these at the end of the call to today. So about 47% of those businesses thought that the challenges going on at the moment were short term, and about a third, so the green, about a third of those businesses thought that challenge was longer term and might require some change, e.g. diversification. And then the second question we asked, similar today, was, what about your customers? And actually here, the green was about 40% of businesses thought their customers were only facing a short-term challenge, but actually nearly 60% of businesses thought their customers were going to see some long-term challenge and therefore probably require some strategic change themselves. And so it's really, really important to sort of not only consider your own business, but to consider the sector you're in and your customers. McKinsey came out with quite a nice model here, where they looked at levels of distress by sector and how quickly things would recover, whether they be short-term recovery on the right or much longer-term recovery on the left. And it's really useful to sort of consider the timing aspect of sectors recovering or remaining in distress. And we've cleaned this out, and we'll be sending the slides out on the recording. So using tools like this to sort of, you know, judge how the sector you're involved in and your own supply chain is sort of really useful. The other indicators out there, and this data is out there, the other things to consider are, this was just some data in the FT one weekend, but, you know, indicators being around executives taking pay cuts, are staff still furloughed, have there been job cuts, are dividends reduced? Because all of this stuff, as you can see here, all of these indicators vary sector by sector. And I guess we've all been through figuring this out from a COVID perspective. And now some sectors certainly are having to go through a similar process, thinking about it from a Brexit scenario. And one of the things to consider is when you're sort of selling into sectors that are in various states of distress, is to consider, have they actually got the capacity to listen? Because interestingly, and very relevant to shorts, we were campaigning into accountancies last year, and getting accountants to listen at the time was next to impossible, because they were so busy with their own customers who were under distress and uncertainty. So you have to really consider the level to which a sector can listen to you. It doesn't matter what your product is, if they simply haven't got the capacity to listen. However, there's always growth going on out there. There are always sectors that are doing well, no matter what's going on. And again, that data can be readily available. So here's a publicly available example: Europe's 1,000 fastest growing companies. 189 of them in the UK. We're all about growth, so we're sort of talking to them. So sectors, there are certain sectors that are really benefiting from the change, and just a very quick look and think, to highlight sectors that are growing, it's relatively easy to do. And one of the things that we always look at is investment data. So Crunchbase, Deal Room, PitchBook, look at those sorts of databases to see which companies and sectors are attracting investment. There's a lot of money out there looking for a home. There's still significant investment going on. So, consider that around your own sector, your customer sector, and also the wider supply chains that you're part of. One of the things to also consider is, this is sort of interesting data, is think about how you're actually marketing, and we're going to get into some tactics in a second. But what was really interesting last year was in Q1 on the left there, most value propositions were being, so most businesses were selling their products by talking about making money. And very quickly, what you see there moving from Q1 to Q2 is there was a real switch in everyone started sort of marketing their propositions about saving money. And so there's some real sort of thinking that you need to do in terms of how are you actually presenting yourself, and how are you marketing yourself to improve your market penetration. So what I'm going to do now is just go through 2 slides of sort of tactics to make sure that you are maximizing your activity with your existing products and your existing markets. So the first thing we'd always sort of recommend is really reassess who your core customer is. And if you haven't done this for, I would say, more than 3 months, 4 months, then I would sort of relook at this. And equally, I would relook at your core messaging and your value proposition and give it some revision. If you need to revise your messaging, check it out and test it out in small ways. Make calls, speak to existing customers before you go and rebuild the website. So test things out. I think it's also a good idea to create temporary prices, offers, rebundling, etc., to help with any sort of short-term campaigns, freshen things up. And also, it goes without saying, just make sure you've got some decent sort of sales and marketing tools in place. In terms of some campaign ideas and activities that we recommend, so the first thing is just hit all of your, so let's say you've revamped your marketing, you've revamped your messaging, you might have a fresh offer. So go to all of your existing customers from the last 2 years. They're relatively low-hanging fruit for you. And the trick here is to be really sort of strict about it. There's always lots of reasons, well, we can't talk to them because of X, Y, and Z. But actually just be religious, go and speak to all of your previous customers and sell them, the revised offer. Leverage all of your managers' personal networks. Everyone's connected on LinkedIn. Push that offer out, push that refresh messaging out. It doesn't cost you anything, and it can be remarkably productive. And then in terms of targeting pockets of growth, target high growth businesses with specific messaging. Target sectors that are not affected, that actually, are not affected by what's going on at the moment, again, with specific messaging, or sectors less affected. And then, of course, as we've mentioned, identify sectors seeing growth and then target them with specific messaging. The next 2 points here are sort of can be incredibly productive, number 8 and 9, so non-core and full-timers. Most management teams are still having to look at what is core and non-core for their businesses. So if you're providing a service that is deemed and a management team have decided that it's not core for them, then that of course is an opportunity for you, because they could sub that out to you. It's very much a senior level conversation, very much a chief exec sort of level conversation with a management team that's decided that certain activities are non-core and you could do them. The next point there around full-timers is, where businesses have got staff that carry out what you do full-time, the furlough situation remains unclear. There could be companies that still need to sort of reduce cost, and that's very much a sort of a CFO conversation. It doesn't mean that people can be made redundant. It means that you might be able to take on those staff and in fact expand your business by taking on staff that another company needs to reduce. Then getting back to sort of more typical campaign activity, you know, one of the easiest sales strategies is just to focus on similar customers, you know, so a very niche campaign focus. Customers are always interested to hear what their competitors are buying and what their competitors are up to. So that's a really simple campaign to push out, as is something that's sort of local, a local campaign. So for us, we're based in Brighton. The rewards from that might not be huge short term, but longer term, there might be some side benefits, you know, so improving your employer branding and helping you recruit in the future. In terms of attacking competitors, personally, I find this more at the fun end of life. You know, how aggressive are you being to your competitors? The crazy Zoom background guy, one of his businesses had a 3-year runway. So they had 3 years worth of cash in the bank. So he was out there absolutely mauling his competitors because he could afford to. So the question is, to what extent are you being aggressive with your competition and really out there trying to take business off them? And then lastly, as I mentioned, have a look at businesses relevant to you that have raised finance. They will have received that money because they're growing, and if they're growing, they've got money to spend and they have service needs. So there's some ideas there to have a think about. The next 2 slides here are sort of more product sales and marketing ideas, and actually we do have all of this these sort of ideas tied up in a book that actually will an ebook that will get to you via Shorts. So that you can have a think about some of these ideas in a bit more detail. So what I did there was just think about or put to you a number of examples or ideas to check that you're actually making the most of your existing products and your existing markets that could fund diversification or prevent the need of it. So at this point, though, I'll hand over to Monica, who will talk about diversification in much more detail. Monica.
Thank you very much, Tom. So the key question for us is really like, should we put all our eggs in one basket? So this is a big question, a question that companies have been asking themselves all the time. And it's really a dilemma that they are facing. Is it better to be specialized or diversified? Is it better to focus on a niche that maybe you are currently occupying, or focus on the core business, or maybe identify alternative option to grow your business in a different direction? And if that's the case, under what condition does diversification actually creates value for your business? If you decide to diversify, there will be many costs you will have to bear. So it's really like diversification allowing your business to create value. Is there an optimal degree of diversification? By optimal degree of diversification, I mean, is there a point where you really need to stop diversifying because the costs inherent into diversification are too high, and the complexity stemming from that is making coordinating the business too costly for you? And finally, are there any synergies that you can exploit through diversification? That's really a key point that companies need to address. So the exploitation of potential synergies is one of the key reasons that drives diversification efforts from companies. The things to start with is really like agreeing on a definition of diversification. So what do we mean by diversification? And diversification is a business development strategy by which companies enter new markets and enter new products or services. So that's what drives what we call diversification. The second point is really like trying and understand what are the main reasons for diversification. So why do companies diversify? So the main reasons for diversification are really like grow. Grow is one of the main drivers of diversification for firms. So maybe you are in a stagnating industry, your business is not performing well anymore. So diversification becomes for you a way to generate new revenues. But while there is evidence that diversification contributes to growth, what about profitability? Is also profitability increasing as a result of diversification? We will talk about that in a minute. Another drivers of diversification is risk reduction. So if you put your eggs in different baskets, you might be able to become more resilient over time. So developing a portfolio diversification strategy definitely reduces the economic risk. Some companies decide to diversify because it's really a matter of survival for them. Think of Fujifilm. The company at some point was experimenting decline in the industry, so diversifying was really a matter of surviving for the company. We will also talk about this example later on. And as I said, one of the main reasons for diversification is the exploitation of synergies, using resources and assets across different businesses, and really like being able to leverage the competencies that you have in-house to make more businesses successful. So when I was highlighting this as one of the key dilemmas that companies faces. So is actually diversification creating value for the business? That's not always the case. And there are 3 simple tests that you can run to understand whether the diversification strategy that you have in mind might actually to contribute to create value for your business or not. These are called Porter's 3 tests. We have the attractiveness test. So when you try and think about diversifying, try to pick a market, an industry where there is a potential to make a profit. That's what we call an attractive industries. The second test you should run is the cost of entry test. So you should try and understand whether the cost of entering this new business is going to exceed the potential profit you can make. If that's the case, probably is not a right choice. But the most important test is what we call the better off test. So before embarking on diversification, you should try and understand whether by diversifying, your firm can achieve significant synergies across the different businesses. So that's because the primary source of the value creation from diversification is really exploiting these synergies among different businesses. How? By sharing the resources and capabilities that you have. That's what we call economies of scope. They can stem from sharing tangible resources, such as distribution networks or IT systems. They can stem from sharing intangible resources. So maybe you can leverage your brand or your reputation and know-how across different businesses. But they can also stem from sharing organizational capabilities. What type of capabilities? They can be technical, financial, or marketing capabilities that you have developed over time and are applicable to different businesses. So when these 3 different tests and the results of these different tests show that there are some positive benefits that you can achieve, then diversification is actually a potential to create value. So this is when diversification creates value, but you should also consider how to diversify. So what are the different modes and type of the diversification option that open up to you? You might lack the capabilities and resources to pursue a new business. So what are the options that you have? You can either decide to develop them internally, or you can decide to pool resources with other companies, so cooperate with them, or even acquiring another business and internalize those resources. These 3 different options to embark on diversification have different implications in terms of time, cost, and risk. Internal development has typically a huge cost, so developing internally the resources and competencies to run a new business takes time and has a huge cost. Cooperation allows to pool resources with other companies and in a way to minimize the risk, while acquisition, again, can entail a huge cost since you have to acquire a new business. There might be issues related to integration of this business that you have to keep into consideration. So when assessing these different diversification options, really take into consideration these different time, cost, and risk implications. There are 2 main types of diversification. That's what we call related and unrelated diversification. So some companies decide to enter business with which they can have in common several assets. So if there are meaningful commonalities with the existing business, we talk about related diversification. But there are also companies that decide to enter completely unrelated business in which there are no significant resources and competencies that can be shared. So research shows, and there is plenty of evidence about that, that companies that embark in related diversification typically perform better than companies that embark in unrelated diversification. And that's mainly stemming from the reason why is that if you go for a related diversification, you can actually create more synergies about the different businesses. So we talk about the potential of creating value and generating profitability through diversification. And we said relatedness is one of the key factors impacting on that. When we talk about relatedness, again, we refer to the potential for sharing resources and capabilities among businesses. But there are two main types of relatedness that we have to consider. One is operational relatedness, where the synergies are stemming from pulling together or leveraging your manufacturing, marketing, and distribution capabilities across different businesses. For instance, you may share distribution channels, and that may result in cost savings for the business, so you can economize on cost. Other types of relatedness is strategic relatedness. In this case, the synergies are deriving from the ability to apply common management capabilities to different businesses. That's the case. A good example is, for instance, Virgin. Virgin is operating different businesses, but leverage these managing capabilities, excellent managing capabilities, across the different businesses that are part of the Virgin Group. Relatedness, we said, is one of the key factors to assess the value creation potential of your diversification strategy. But let's not forget that there are several costs and challenges that you have to face when diversifying. One of the key costs are coordination costs. Of course, you are adding new line of businesses, and you will have more activities to coordinate. There will be increased complexity, and that will result in increased costs for your business. You might also face a lack of expertise and competencies in the new business that you are entering. So how are you going to address that? You might need to hire people. You might need to develop these competencies inside or partner with other companies. So again, these will create further costs for your companies. As a result of diversification, your response to market changes in your core business could be slower. So you might be slower to detect changes in the market, but also to respond with innovative solutions. Finally, one of the key challenges you might have to face as a result of diversification is also a lack of or diversion in the managerial attention from the core business. So you will have to take care of more activities. Maybe the attention you were giving to the core business previously won't be possible to be devoted to the business again, because you will have to spread that attention across different activities. So keep always these challenges and drawbacks in mind when evaluating the potential benefits of embarking into a diversification strategies. So now some examples of successful diversification. One is Walt Disney. Walt Disney moved from animated movies to theme parks and resorts and other line of business. It could exploit really like the brand it had created over time and the reputation, its ability to engage with the same community of customers to embark in these different businesses and to make them profitable. Another example of successful diversification is Virgin Group. I was saying earlier that Virgin Group has thousands of companies within the group umbrella that go from music production to travel, financial services. Some of these businesses have not been successful, so they have been dismissed over time. But still, the Virgin Group could leverage again the brand and reputation that had built in its initial business initiatives to engage with other customers that were valuing the quality, the reputation of the product, and their innovative positioning. A different example, this time an example from Fujifilm company. So the company was operating in the photographic film industry, and it was engaged in huge rivalry with Kodak. At some point, that business was declining, and in order to survive, the company engaged in an assessment of its key technical capabilities. So they really tried to understand what they were strengths in terms of technological capabilities. After that, they realized that they had strong chemical capabilities that could be applicable also to the cosmetics and pharmaceutical industry. And that's what they did. So they managed to survive by diversifying into cosmetics and pharmaceutical by leveraging their key capabilities in chemicals. Another example is Johnson & Johnson. This is an example of related diversification. The company positioned itself as an healthcare company, and there are three main businesses under the umbrella of Johnson & Johnson: consumer products, pharmaceutical, and medical devices. They all share distribution channels. So this is one of the synergies that they pursue, sharing distribution channels, but also sharing their attention for customers. In a way, their customer is at the center of the value proposition, and they take care of customers in different ways by providing pharmaceutical, by providing medical devices, but also providing consumer products. Final example is Apple. Apple entered the market with Mac computers, but it was also diversified into mobile phones, iPods, and music. So, but it could build on synergies in terms of design and in terms of access to a community of developers, so really a platform of developers that could be applicable to all these different product segments. These example of successful diversification you may take inspiration from. But before leaving, I would like to discuss with you some key questions that could guide you in deciding about whether to embark in diversification or not. I went through this very interesting study, and it's a published article in Harvard Business Review that was conducted by a professor at London Business School. So it's a way to understand whether there is actually a potential in the diversification strategy you have outlined or not. So in a way, it's a strategy to reduce the potential risks you are not considering inherent in this diversification strategy. So the first question you should start asking yourself is, what can your company do better than its competitor in its current market? So you are already in a business. What can you do better than other players in that market? What are your key strategic assets? After that, you should try and understand whether the strategic assets that you have identified are also needed to succeed in the new business you want to enter. So what strategic assets you need in this new business? Are there any of those that you already have applicable to this new business? So an example I could give you about that is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, of course, was very strong with Coke, but at some point decided also to enter the wine market because it thought they could leverage knowledge about distribution channels, knowledge about the customers. Well, Coca-Cola, after a few years, decided to exit the wine business. The reason is that a key asset to compete in the wine business is the knowledge of the wine industry, which Coca-Cola didn't have. So making sure that you understand what are the strategic levers in the new business you want to enter is key to be successful in that business. Another question you should ask yourself is whether you can catch up with the competitors or you can even overtake the competitors if you enter that new business. What do we mean by that? An example I could give you is Canon. So you enter a new business, there are already very established players, maybe they have already a huge market share in the market. So how can you make sure that you get a share in the market and you are able to overtake this competition? Canon entered the photocopy market at some point, but it was facing a huge competition from Xerox. Xerox was selling through direct sales market, but Canon managed to overtake them by developing a network of dealers. So selling the product, really changing the rules of competition in the market by identifying a new strategic lever. Another question you could ask yourself is whether to pursue this diversification strategy you have in mind, you will need to break up your strategic assets. Think of McDonald's. McDonald's, of course, has a very kind of established audience, but the success of McDonald's rests on many different factors, many capabilities and assets that the company was able to develop over time. So this professor that ran this study, talking about the manager he had attending one of these classes, was asking them, if you were McDonald's, how would you diversify? By entering the frozen food business, by entering the photo processing business, by entering the theme parks business. When giving their answer, 40% of the attendees said they would diversify by entering the theme park business, 30% the frozen food business, and 30% the photo processing business. The reason for this diversity in terms of responses is that they were really considering different types of synergies and strategic assets that McDonald's could leverage when entering these new businesses. But what they didn't consider is that, or maybe some of them considered because they raised that question, was that McDonald's is successful because it's leveraging all those different assets and competencies together. So think of whether if you embark in a new business, you will be able to keep of these strategic assets together or not. Two final questions. One is about competitive advantage. If you enter this new business, will you be simply a player in this new market, or you will be able to emerge as a winner as a result of a competitive advantage you will be able to develop, something that makes you stand out from the crowd and win the competition. And finally, if you enter this new business and new market, will you learn something that could be applicable to your core business, something that can make your core business more successful over time? So this is really like a way to navigate and the space of diversification and try and assess whether there are significant benefits that you could achieve as a result of pursuing a diversification strategy, like a checklist that can help you reduce the gamble inherent in embarking in diversification. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Monica. That's great. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get into some SME and mid-market examples and sort of look at some comparative stories here compared to the bigger brands. The first example I'm going to use is this was a business getting into some product development. Security Bureau were an established business in cybersecurity space. So they did penetration testing. So testing out people's or businesses' digital defenses and then highlighting problems to them. And the service was provided on a sort of a day rate. So if you imagine a bunch of people sat there that did work on a day rate basis, it was a good business. It was established 3 or 4 years, well respected, well known, but they wanted to grow, and the business model was sort of somewhat limited. So if we look at the sort of SWOT of that business at the time, there were no, in the bottom right, there were no real threats really, but if they had not done nothing, they might have become obsolete in time. And in terms of the weaknesses, there was one that sort of stuck out, which was they didn't really have any recurring revenues. It was just day rate stuff. And personally, I think, not having recurring revenues does make growth sort of harder. In terms of the strengths though, great reputation, really knowledgeable, and there was some ambition there. So the opportunities were to sort of try to take a disruptive approach to what was a fairly dusty marketplace. The penetration marketplace is quite slow, time consuming, not very slick. So there was an opportunity to take a fresh approach and to build out a scalable product. Now, for those on the call last week around growth, we looked at start, stop, continue. So continue the good things, stop the bad things, because you need to create space to start doing the high growth activities, whether this be product, services, customers, or geographies. So in this case, they decided to continue the penetration testing. It was a good, solid business. It was profitable. They were very good at it, etc. But what they decided to stop doing, and this was a small SME at the time, they turned over, let's say, £250,000 a year. The managing director did consultancy, about 50 grand's worth a year. So it felt like valuable money for them. But the problem was it took all of his time and energy. So they decided to write that off, to stop doing that, and then to start to build out a software platform that would really help drive their growth and would help the business scale with recurring revenues. Okay, so a brave decision in the middle, stop 50 grand's worth of business that was a large percentage of their activity at the time, but to allow the growth over here. Okay, they were really quite bold about this, so they rebranded the business. They went from Security Bureau to Informa, so they changed their brand, their trading, etc. That business now is already 4 or 5 times bigger, and they've got some really significant plans for the future. So a really good example, a nice example of product development, diversifying, presenting and providing a new service to existing customers. There's some interesting lessons there. They were good at funding the investment required there from working capital. Okay, so their penetration testing business that they continued, that funded all the growth. You could, if you needed to, though, present a put together a well-presented growth strategy and go and raise some money to fund that sort of product development. They were brave about stopping the consultancy work. It took a lot of time and energy, and relatively speaking, it was low value. The next few points are really 4, 5, and 6 are around skills. So when moving into a new sort of product or service, you're likely to have to recruit in some new skills, whether that be around product management or marketing, because product positioning and pricing become sort of quite unfamiliar challenges. So these guys were operating in a relatively dusty space of pen testing. And the way I explained it to the chief exec was like, look, you're going to go down a slip road onto the motorway into the fast lane because you're now going to be competing with this digital product against teams all over the world. So much sharper sales and marketing skills were required. And so they've hired those skills in because they very much need them. The other lessons here were to start small and test assumptions, and also use use your existing customers. So if you've got existing customers, you've basically got free market research right on your doorstep. They knew their customers well. They went and asked them exactly what they would require from the new software product, and they got that right. So leverage your your existing customers, and of course you can cross-sell to them very easily. So that was a nice example of relatively low risk, stopping something that wasn't particularly, had no growth in it, but then develop a new service to sell to your existing customers. The second example I'm going to use is one that was driven by distress. And this was a technology business owned by a couple of Norwegians, but actually the business was about 20 people in Krakow in Poland. And this is a story of full diversification because they were about to go bust. The product at the time that they had was quite clever. It helped you for pretty much zero cost to back up the data that you had on your mobile phone. And so it was very clever technically. If we look at it, though, from a marketplace point of view, the problem these guys had was threat of substitution, so down the bottom. And so what happened was along came Apple with iCloud, and then along came Google with Android. And all of a sudden, these guys, their core product became substituted with some really significant competitors, and pretty much overnight, no one was going to buy their service, and they were going to go bust. So the situation was, looking at a SWOT, was the threat was imminent bankruptcy. The weaknesses were they had no money. The Norwegians weren't willing to put any more money in. They'd been propping up the business for a little time. 20 people versus Apple wasn't going to happen. And also the MD was very sharp technically, but not the leader that they needed there and then. So we took a look at the business, and what we saw straight away, though, was they had incredibly strong development skills. So these guys had quietly developed this mobile technology against pretty much every single mobile phone in the world. So they had really deep mobile tech skills, a really talented CTO, and they had very, very low costs. Their cost base was about 20% of the UK. So not 20% cheaper, but 20% of the cost. So what we helped them do very quickly, and I'm talking, 15 minutes of discussion and decision making, was we killed off the product and we just decided to completely repoint the business on providing cutting edge mobile development services into the UK. They were incredibly skilled and they had a really low cost base. And that proved to be highly successful, and the business went from pretty much overnight, went from going bust to being incredibly profitable. And then actually within about 18 months, the biggest UK customer bought the whole company out and then took that on to an even bigger exit. So the Norwegians were extremely happy. They got a load of money rather than losing their shirts. The Polish guys were really pleased because they kept their jobs and actually ended up working on really interesting stuff. And the UK customer was really happy to receive fantastic service at a low cost, and then actually grew that business and exited very successfully. So the learning points here in this sort of interesting example was, if you're under pressure, are going to go bust, you need to act. Arguably, those guys left that a bit long, but then we made some really quick decisions. We went in with just a couple of tools and some objective sort of fresh pair of eyes, and we could very quickly see what they had to do. And we were very bold about that. We didn't mess around at all. We made decisions quickly and repointed the business. And then, we did have to make some leadership changes there because the skills needed to sort of grow the new business were very different to the old business. There were a couple of things there. So we did actually sell the intellectual property that had been developed. I think it was sold for a little bit of money to someone else in Poland. There were some legacy contracts to get out of because the business was now doing something completely different. The other sort of key learning point there was, we didn't mess around sort of talking about any big grand sales and marketing plans. We picked up the phone, we called customers in the UK who might require high-end mobile services at a low cost. And we got some customers really quickly. So it was very much, the sales and marketing strategy was very much focusing in on who really needs this service and then contacting them. And then we were referred to, those customers were really happy with the service and then referred us on. And ultimately that business, as I said, went through to a successful exit. So it went from bust to boom very quickly. The third example I'm just going to touch on is a brand that I'm sure everyone can recognize, Tesco. And this is an example of market development. So moving into a new marketplace with pretty much existing products. And I'll go through this quite quickly. So Tesco were actually in the US. They had a store in LA in about 2007. And they had about 40 people living in the US to try to sort of do the research and figure out what to do. So they came up with this fresh and easy concept, fresh, healthy approach. They thought it would resonate with the West Coast. They went for a smaller store format, so about 20% of normal. Lots of ready meals, which of course was a Tesco sort of core product. The idea being people could pop in and buy, self-service checkout, which I think they had in the UK. It did grow to about 200 stores, but only of 200 out of about 1,000. Cost about $500 million to set up. And a long story short, in the end, they sold that on, losing a lot of money, and ultimately it went bankrupt. So this is an example I use because it's an example of market development that went wrong. Some of the reasons were, and there are some big generalizations here, but they thought that people would go for a quick shop, and actually Americans preferred to do a big bulky weekly shop. So that didn't resonate. Within the store, again, their existing products were sort of ready meals, and actually American consumers prefer takeouts or cooking. So that didn't work. Bagged up food didn't work. People preferred to pick and choose their own fruits and vegetables, etc. So things in string bags didn't resonate locally. And in terms of self-service at the time, the US has a very strong service culture, with someone, say, bagging up the food and putting it into a brown paper bag. So self-service didn't work either. And then outside the store, there were some interesting sort of mistakes. US retailers aren't stupid. So they had all of the leases on the roads out of cities. because whilst Tesco seemed to have their stores on the roads into cities, and no one was going to do a big shop and leave the food sitting in the car all day. And then the other thing was in some of the stores, they used the UK car parking template. So if you think about the white lines on the tarmac, they used the UK version of that. And actually the US, of course, have bigger cars. So there's some really sort of interesting sort of mistakes there. And if I contrast that with Volkswagen, Volkswagen, I can't remember the model, but Volkswagen were looking to take one of their models into the US. So a left-hand drive car that could be marketed to the Americans. They did some research, and their research threw up that, yes, people drive around with really big cups, coffee and soda cups. It meant that they would have to reconfigure their coffee cup holders, and actually to such an extent that they actually had to re-engineer their gearbox. And so if you can imagine the marketing people telling the German engineers they had to re-engineer their gearbox, this was sort of quite a big thing, but they did it successfully, and Volkswagen entered the States and have actually been doing incredibly well because they got that sort of bit of market development research right. So there's a couple of things here. I think there's a fundamental question that we've definitely faced, or I've definitely faced in my time, and that is, you know, do you do heavy research in advance, you know, where you're going to make fewer mistakes? You'll probably get faster penetration once you get into the market. And of course, that's going to protect your sort of brand and reputation. The downside is that you need to invest in that time, effort, and resources to do that. And it's going to take longer. So you might miss an opportunity. I wonder, for debate, is that better suited to products? And on the right, alternatively, do you enter a market and find out along the way what people want? It's much faster to do that. You can grab opportunities, and you're very much dealing with reality, because if you're trying to sell to people, you're getting immediate feedback of what they do and don't want. There is, of course, a risk of getting that wrong, possibly legal issues. And you know, if you get that wrong and have to reverse out, of course, that could be a bit embarrassing. But I do wonder, is that approach better suited to services and possibly software? Because we've used that approach ourselves in the past, where we've gone into a market, a geographical market, and we've figured things out along the way. So I'll leave you with those sort of two thoughts. In the slides, we have some additional content here around geographies, but we've sort of slightly run out of time for today. That's something we could possibly do in the future. So just to summarize the talk, what we've looked at is diversification, and we've looked at these examples, existing products and existing markets, and we've looked at the sort of tactics there to make sure that you're penetrating as well as possible. Product development was Informa, developing a software platform for their existing clients. Market development was the contrast between Tesco and Volkswagen, both entering the US, one getting it right, one getting it wrong. And then lastly, the highest risk was full diversification, which was Sinqia, about to go bust. But actually they got that right by focusing in on their strengths and selling new services to a new market. So just to make sure we have enough time to do the poll, very quickly on us, we're a software business ourselves, and we run a platform that helps companies understand and build out their strategies and then execute them. We've worked with Shorts now since about middle of last year. So, you know, any questions about us, then, you know, please have a chat to the Shorts team. And in the interest in time, because we're slightly short on time, Malcolm, I'll hand back to you, and perhaps we could have a quick chat about the poll results and any questions that have come in.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Monica. So yes, I think coming up on your screen should be a breakdown of the results. So what I've also got access to is the results that Tom referred to from the same webinar sort of 9 months ago. So in terms of question one, and what you can see is the answers are very much similar to where we were before. So half of those surveyed saw a short-term challenge, but nothing long-term. Slightly more confidence from what I can see in terms of those that can carry on business as usual. So for Tom, Monica, the interesting thing for me is then probably comparing that to question two, where essentially a quarter of those surveyed have said there's no real impact, carry on business as usual.
Yeah.
Whereas for our customers, it's half.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, it's interesting that the level of impact seems to be sort of so low, given the amount of change that's been going on, you know, and the issues that people are dealing with. I think the thing is, it's it differs so much by sector, doesn't it? You know, some sectors remain really quite distressed, and some sectors at the other end of the spectrum are seeing sort of massive growth. So I think the reason for that is very much a sort of depends where you're sitting, which sector and which supply chain would be my take on it.
Yeah,
I tend to agree with Tom. I think he's very much sector dependent. So we should really have details about the people that, what type of industry they are in. Some industries have been heavily impacted, some other not at all, and are actually booming as a result of the situation. So
okay.
I tend to agree with Tom.
One of the questions is, how do you know how long to give your survival tactics initiatives before assessing if diversification, if in fact needed? So if we can just broaden that question slightly to say, how long should you give your diversification tactics?
Okay, I think the answer to that really, in a practical sense, comes down to cash flow and runway. I think, you know, if you sort of focus on trying to strengthen up on existing products and existing customers, I think have a look at your runway, set yourself a certain amount of time to hopefully achieve a certain amount of results. And then if you're hitting that deadline and just not seeing any improvement, then you know that you're going to have to make some sort of a change. But I would think I would definitely try to be thinking at least one step ahead there if you're worried about it not working out. But at the end of the day, it comes down to cash flow and runway.
Okay, and what's the longest either of you have seen in terms of the time taken to obtain success for a new venture?
That's Monica. What's your view on that?
So that would really depend on, again, whether the diversification is related or unrelated diversification. For unrelated diversification, it takes longer, first of all, to be implemented and then to provide, to see outcomes. For the related diversification is a bit quicker. It depends also on whether you're going to do that through internal development or by acquisition or cooperation. But I would say in a couple of years, at least, you could see already some kind of impact on your business. It really depends on the timeline that you have for the implementation of that diversification strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. So just conscious of time, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Tom and Monica, as well as Joe and Megan, the teams behind us in terms of getting you all invited on this and getting the webinar up and running. As we mentioned at the start, this is the second of 4. So if you missed the first webinar, which was Plan for Growth, then please get in contact and we can get a copy out to you. And as I said before, we've got another webinar coming up on Thursday and then one in a couple of weeks' time. So please look at those and book on if relevant. So hope you all have a good Monday. Hopefully it's as successful as it can be. And if you've got any questions, please get in contact. So once again, thank you, Monica. Thank you, Tom.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.